from the lucid fringe. Ravings from the lucid fringe. Musings from an unpasteurized life. Improvised on the front line of love and beauty. Welcome, I'm Semeric Yarrow. This week on Ravings from the Lucid Fringe, east of the Tsitsikamma, Holmes number 4, Eastern Cape ancestors. Nearly 40 years ago, my mother's father went to bed in East London, a port city in the easternmost region of the old Cape province, and didn't wake up. He was alone, and he was found after not turning up for a rehearsal or perhaps a performance of the local, mostly amateur symphony orchestra that he conducted. When I turned up in post-apartheid South Africa 10 years later, and met his sister and her extended family, most of whom had moved to Cape Town in recent years but were also long-term inhabitants of the Eastern Cape, visiting this other highly populated Cape province rose up my agenda. I eventually paid a pilgrimage to his home on a road trip through the area. It would be fair to say that Grandad Gordon was not the greatest anti-apartheid activist. He quietly got on with the comforts of white South Africa and avoided getting political, though he'd flown British bombers against Nazi Germany in previous years. At the same time, the few times I met him, I remember him fondly, not least because he was my first, most encouraging mentor on the trombone that became my first musical love. A cultured colonial man, born in Mumbai, lived in post-war West Berlin, spent many years with his second wife in Nigeria, and then landed in the RSA, where he married and divorced once more. And now, of course, an ancestor I hadn't really realized was calling me to call this country home. There were plenty of other reasons to visit. The Eastern Cape was renowned for being down-to-earth and friendly. My early months in Cape Town were quite lonely. This extraordinary city, where I've subsequently lived most of my life, initially proving its reputation as too cliquey by half. However, besides a warm welcome, my earliest impressions of the Eastern Cape in the 90s were also of fusty academic bookshelves, featuring unique imprints about cultures, geographies, faunas that I knew little of, but which gave me a hint of research, engagement, interest that stretched way beyond my own fields of learning to that point. A certain genteel, liberal Anglo attitude which stood out more in these backwaters. There's a large strip of the province, roughly from East London west to Port Elizabeth, or as it's recently been renamed, Ebeja, a very much less Anglo name, which could be described from one angle as settler country. It also happens to be part of a small strip of South Africa, also stretching to the north, where you will find African hedgehogs. That seems appropriately provincially Anglo in itself. Mrs. Tiggywinkle in Africa. In the heart of this settler region lies Grahamstown, holding the oldest Anglican cathedral in the country, of course, and now renamed Makhanda, after the chief that warred against Graham and the British settlers 2 centuries ago. I popped in on Spirit Fest one year, expecting an eclectic reflection of multifaceted spirituality, as per other festivals I've attended, closer to chic and sometimes cutting-edge Cape Town. But in Grahamstown, Spirit Fest was specifically about art that honoured the church. Small C conservatism, writ large. Makhanda still holds some great liberal institutions that I first encountered there. The High Court, where a relative had worked for years as an isiXhosa interpreter. The prestigious boarding schools, their vast sports grounds and Hogwarts-style buildings dominating much of the city centre, where other relatives played first-team rugby and whose dorms I've slept in a few times while on National Jazz Festival performer duty. And Rhodes University, a historic curiosity, distinctly founded on the British academic model, as well as its model of multiple residences and institutional breakfasts. Named for the old bastard who still has too many things erected in his honour, his ill-gotten gains left in his will to the nation to found a bunch of things and try to con us into remembering him more kindly, though if he'd had any close family, no doubt they would have got the lot. Rhodes University was and is home to some wonderful minds and bodies. Andrew Buckland, perhaps our most renowned South African physical theatre performer, lectured there for years, where I first stood up and performed poetry at a rather intellectual open mic night. It might have been far from the raw, rap-inspired spoken word in mid-2000s Long Street in downtown Cape Town, but it was still a receptive and supportive gathering for those who loved words. I first entered Grahamstown by night after a 2-hour drive from PE Airport. It was a short distance by South African standards, but just about the emptiest drive in terms of car numbers I'd ever done in my life to that point. And Grahamstown was a small place to reach after all that time in the dark. A week getting to grips with excitement with the new post-apartheid constitution in a course on environmental law, and more specifically how activists could use the new Bill of Rights and other statutes for our purposes. The late Brian Peckham was the passionate lecturer, guiding us down these arcane corridors of legal thought. In the evenings, I drank beer in friendly pubs and made friends and even got to dance in dark clubs. A little bit of 20-something normality. On later visits, I listened to Frank Zappa over joints and lit fireworks on the hillsides. I also travelled south to hang out with cover bands in Bathurst pubs, a little bit of musical Anglo-land in a village with heritage buildings, monuments and plaques. One new Grahamstown friend told me how racist her relatives were. British Liverpudlians who had moved here to take advantage of apartheid's opportunities. They were the first, but definitely not the last pro-apartheid European immigrants I heard of, who often expressed their racism much more gratuitously than those who'd grown up here. I was determined not to be the same. It was quite a change of view from my teenage life in the UK, where the satirical TV show Spitting Image sang a hilarious popular song called I've Never Met a Nice South African, and that's not bloody surprising, man, 'cause they're a bunch of arrogant bastards who hate black people. Smugness personified. The overseas anti-apartheid movement was of course a great part of the final collapse of the regime, yet there's no doubt that through it ordinary first worlders got to sound righteous without much effort to actually engage on the issue, except for, say, renaming my college bar after Nelson Mandela and the pool room after Winnie. My own thumbsuck take in first encountering the actual whites of this ex-British Dominion was that 10% were genuinely fanatically racist, a fair number of whom were busy emigrating to Australia. 80%, including my late grandpa, were kind of like your average middling European, and 10% were among the most extraordinary people on the planet, really doing their best to break down barriers, and I wanted to get to know them. But of course, whites were just a minority. In Port Elizabeth, the Eastern Cape's biggest, most industrialised city, my new black colleague was delighted to take me on wild trips into the historic township of New Brighton, where we drank quarts of Black Label in legendary illegal drinking holes like Joe's Jazz Bar. There I discussed Jonas Gwangwa's trombone playing and practiced my first isikosa. And on travels into family homes around the area, I met multiple people that he introduced as his brothers, because our English words for relatives are so nondescript in comparison to more community-minded languages. Back in the somewhat twee centre of the city, we ate a rather bad curry in a place hilariously called Up the Khyber. Hilarious if you know anything about Cockney rhyming slang or carry-on movies. Served by a disinterested Afrikaans waitress. Eastern exoticism of a kind I had not expected. Still, something about being in the back of beyond in the Eastern Cape still freaked me a little. Or perhaps it was the proximity to the town where Grandad had died and Biko had tried. I've always felt the ancestral forces to be strong in this province. As I've discovered more of it, that feeling has grown. I've played music in Makanda, watched shows, been part of the cultural buzz of the National Arts Festival, South Africa's underfunded version of Edinburgh. The joke was that the festival was taking place 10 hours away from Johannesburg, Cape Town and Durban, so was equally difficult to reach from all three of South Africa's main urban centres. But it distills something else thereby. Many of those I worked with or heard have since passed themselves. They are ancestors I tune into in the search for my own creativity. Port Elizabeth, as it was home to a bunch of slightly manic edginess. High levels of bridge suicides, bikers, Satanists rebelling as they do against the overly bland versions of Christianity they grew up with. A good friend, Marcus Wyatt, was accused as a teen at PE's leading boys' school of being a morphy for doing that most effeminate of non-rugby playing activities and learning to play the trumpet instead. A generation previously, Athol Fugard wrote and produced shoestring plays in the city that eventually, embodied by John Carney and Winston Shawner, won Tony Awards and helped the big global fight against the government. And Shawner died in old age a few years ago in New Brighton, where he'd returned after global success. I recall my colleague Boyce telling how the township was on one side of the toxic ever-ready battery factory, and the poor whites who worked there lived on the other side. The prevailing wind, of course, flowed towards the black area, carrying the emissions with it. Apartheid was revolting right down to the petty details. Gqeberha, in Nelson Mandela Bay, is the real historical heart of the fight against it. Karoo, in the Transkei, is where the great man grew up. We were in PE, Gqeberha, to fight another kind of fight in the 90s, for the environment and against pollution, building a surprising coalition of township dwellers, nature conservationists and wealthy farmers, like the Fitzpatricks, descendants of Sir Percy, who wrote Jock of the Bushveld, the classic South African children's story, and who had started growing Cape-branded citrus along the Sundays River, famously exported. Led by Norton Tennille, an experienced former Washington, D.C.-based environmental lawyer who knew how to warm up and cajole and build interest groupings to ultimately soften the new government's industrial development zone at Kucha, east of PE. It became something rather more benign than the toxic chemical hellhole it initially promised to be, within spitting distance of Addo. Addo Elephant National Park. This was where we had our first activist Bosporat, and in my personal history it's where I first drank a shot of Amarula cream and looked at the Milky Way, whose existence with my light-polluted European upbringing I had previously thought to be a metaphor. Also, where we saw meerkat sentries keeping watch at sunset, and encountered a male elephant in must on a narrow dirt track, and reversed our ancient blue student-style city golf at more than the usual reverse speed. Signs everywhere told us not to carry citrus or risk sending elephants crazy. Clearly, the relatively recent history between elephants and citrus farmers had not been an easy one. This was the kind of bushveld Fitzpatrick had written about, dominated by vitamin C-rich speckboom, loved by pachyderms, with aloes on every hillside, ripe for perfect sunsets, hiding kudus and buffaloes at every turn. There's nothing quite like the excitement of moments of watching big game. We have to remember to watch the small beasties too. I've returned to Addo multiple times since then to take others to see what captured my heart there. We also drove up to the cooler climes of Mountain Zebra National Park, grasslands and herds of the small brown zebras all around. Ultimately, the vision is to rejoin all of these big reserves with smaller private land that is held more in awareness of the needs of the animals to move freely between areas without fences. To fence just the area close up to human habitation, though preventing poaching is obviously a big question. Rhinos were in bomas, a beast we have already limited in so many places to a kind of commodity lifestyle. Clever methods are needed to both keep nature's systems in balance and keep human communities sustainable and well nourished. Without predators, for example, baboons easily run amok. The old wary respect between the first peoples and the baboons at risk when fruit is on offer, for example, as East Cape permaculturists have repeatedly told me over the years. Further to the east was the Transkei, as the name suggests, a settler label for the lands across the Great Kyre River from the Cape Colony. East London's cricket and rugby clubs are still known as Border, the border with the Xhosa tribes against whom multiple wars were fought by the settlers. All along the coast, Kenton, Port Alfred, beach resort for Makanda's students and families, famous for its little suspension bridge and a lot of sand, or Hamburg, where friends worked for years to train local women in soft crafts. The lush subtropical landscape takes hold there, until it really bursts forth in the Transkei. The region has its problems. I wrote a little about them, if you listen to my episode Rivers Dance. But it is a rich, magical landscape, untamable in many ways. There is possibility there still of something freer than the late capitalist machine. Rural lifestyles that still allow slowness and connection to topography. There's also problems and local power to contend with. My first Transkei visit in the late 90s included a trip to a bank branch in Umtata, the capital of that district of the province. The only black colleague there in a managerial position we quickly concluded was deeply unhappy, given a token role by the old guard whites, who at that time still bizarrely occupied all the important positions in a bank in a black heritage town, and instructed him just to push paper around. To understand how bizarre that was, you need to realize that the apartheid government gave independence to the Transkei as a Xhosa-run piece of territory, a little bigger than Switzerland, and it had had a black leader, most famously General Bantu Holomisa, still today a South African MP, Deputy Minister, and party leader of the United Democratic Movement. As a homeland, modelled on Native American reservations with its own legal system and government, it made far more geographic sense than others that the South African National Party conjured up, but it remained equally rejected and unrecognised by the international community. With the people who were forcibly removed there over the course of decades, it also shows many signs of overgrazing and the resulting poor soils. Other results today are that the potholes swallow trucks far more than other fixed-up areas of the province. Somehow, 20 years ago, we made it to the lovely coastal reserve of Dwesa in our Beetle. These days, the booking site strongly recommends 4x4 vehicles only. Still, the heritage is strong here, as are the ancestors and the spirits. The beings in the trees and in your dreams are not to be discounted lightly. If you want a juicy fictional ramble through the Transkei, you could do worse than Richard Mason's novel Who Killed Pete Burrell. And then there are the forest birds, that calming connection to a different kind of busyness. South of dusty towns full of minibus taxis, hubs for the main route, Butterworth and Irutiwa. The beehive huts on the hillsides, mostly concrete for the moment, but old, healthier building traditions are still waiting to return. Pedestrians and cows and goats always in danger of bumping into the racing rage of modernity on the unforgiving national highway. Close to the Lesotho border, I walked 30 years ago beneath the shade beside a mountain river, with a woman I played jazz with in the cosmopolitan city. Yet here was her family home on the furthest strange settler edge, near another forgotten name, Lady Grey. South Africans have deep roots. Many of those untold stories, hail from the Eastern Cape, a place where the land, the plants, the vistas, the ancestors keep calling you to slow down. A few weeks back, and considerably west of the Transkei on a sultry afternoon, we passed other university grounds, students milling, meeting, lying on well-maintained lawns, that colonial inheritance of ambivalent value, like so many others. This proud institution once trained Mandela, and for a long time was the only university in South Africa open to natives. It also trained Buthelezi, Mugabe, and a host of other independence leaders of more dubious and conventionally what's-in-it-for-me political traditions, aided by learning European history, no doubt. The University of Fort Hare, 2 hours northeast of Makanda, began before and continued long after the demise of the Ciskei. The Eastern Cape had the misfortune to be the only South African province to have to absorb 2 fully independent homelands in 1994, Transkei and Ciskei, leaving a new provincial government with 3 bureaucracies, 3 sets of laws, far too many ghost workers too quickly, and staring potential bankruptcy in the face from the word go. The town of Alice, which hosts the University of Fort Hare, had the misfortune to fall into Ciskei, this side of the Kai, a strip that was an apartheid project with intense overcrowding and poverty from that time. Bishu was labelled Ciskei's capital and subsequently became the political capital of the whole Eastern Cape province, though it was essentially a satellite township of King Williamstown over the border, another classic settler name. I know, rather uselessly perhaps, that this dates the founding of the town to the 1830s, the last time there was a William on the British throne. Now the name's been wiped away, replaced recently with Conte, a name with 2 clicks for those damned settlers to get their tongues around. Fort Hare University continued, however, and has strong connections to that tree-lined hill station further inland, Hogsback. 3 mountains rise up at this edge of the formidable Amatola Range, with spiny backs that reminded some of warthogs from the plains. But the vibrant Afromontane forest below, hiding so many stories and secrets, is an altogether different kind of place. As the light dances across the paths, I find a river crab on the hillside, somewhat disoriented in her distance from the stream. It's yet again a place for cultures and times to collide and coexist. If Alice, down in the valley, herself conjures up that subconscious Victorian need for fantasy, wonderland, magic, to return, Hogsback provides it in spades. The last time I was here was before Google Maps existed. Now the app is telling me everything is laid out differently to what I recall. Perhaps, I ponder, it's the real topography of Hogsback that has moved so slowly that nobody else has noticed. The first time I camped here in 1997 was at a venue called the Shire. Tolkien looms over the place, his landscapes inspired perhaps by the spiny peaks, though that's a slippery half-truth. For the young boy, jealously claimed as South Africa's most popular writer, was born in Bloemfontein of all places, and left soon after to spend most of his life in Britain, most likely before ever heading south to the Hogs, though perhaps it crept into his childhood dreams. It's a magnetic place of life, seen and unseen, calling for sacred pilgrimage to many of us around the province and the country. This time around, as we descend from a waterfall lined with wild strawberries, as well as cute little red mushrooms that look like they're trying to be mistaken for strawberries, we hear a politician's voice booming out briefly from the speaker system at Hobbiton. Then we pass a big yellowwood that started growing 800 years ago, when Wolfram von Eschenbach was telling enraptured European audiences the epic of Parsifal, taking the medieval listeners into a magical journey with the Holy Grail. Who knows what magic was happening down here then in this ancient forest? It might have blown Tolkien's mind. Some of our walks began under oak trees and near gigantic redwoods. Hogsback has an arboretum on the slopes, a kind of zoo for trees, which I've encountered in other parts of the country too. That desire to bring together curiosities from around the globe probably got going in Cape Town's original company's garden, a starting point for plant stories, for observing plant forms, even if their lives are also spent wondering why they're in this particular climate. A grey lory calls from the brush. Then we rise through leaf and trunk and branch vibrant with growth. Hobbiton was originally set up as a home for war orphans, which makes me think of C.S. Lewis more than Tolkien. I can imagine the two writers puffing a pipe outside the bar at Away with the Fairies in the town. The herbalist running that hostel saw a fairy enter the premises last year, I'm told. Elsewhere, Lothlorien appears as another place to stay these days, along with Imagine Dragons, one for the millennials. Walking on damp forest tracks, even under the summer heat, you can sense the elementals, the unseen energies in this province of ancestors. You can hear them in the trickling waters coming down the waterfalls. One has an impossible natural sculpture sticking out. Some ancestor called it Madonna and Child. Ou Mama Nomentuana, perhaps, for she is definitely not some sort of retiring Mary figure. Blackberries grow beside the forest track. On the other side of the road is Hunter's Tun, the retreat centre belonging to the university. The Scots name is one of those that pop up across South Africa from that weird time when the ruling Brits tried to lean into their Celtic fringes and claim their own wild tribal heritage while dismantling other peoples. While the Scots themselves began a fine and ongoing trade in tribal tartans, invented in the Victorian period to benefit from the craze. Here in Hogsback, looking out at the mysteries of the Forest Valley, is a new retreat space, named for a Cape Town dancer who moved here in her last year of life and poured her love into it before becoming ancestral herself. She's remembered in a labyrinth spiral too, her photo already faded like a guru's. I walk around it, asking myself questions that might only receive answers as the year unfolds. We walked too around the great labyrinth at the edge, where each turn greets me with another of the plants I have seen in the shady zones, and where my daughter sat and meditated of her own accord at the age of 9, many moons ago. The rocks whisper epics at us. New friends eat with us on their lawn, fresh blueberries and plums, while a crown-crested eagle sits and performs for us on a nearby tree. And on departure, at last, a local horseman runs up with a stylized warthog for sale, fashioned from the deep brown clays of the forest. The quality has improved since I was last here 13 years ago. That was certainly the hope and intention of the potters here, whose rustic theatre is on the verge of renewal, a cultural spring perhaps after much composting. Hogsback is enchanting, and perhaps enchanted. Difficult to leave. The first time I ever did so, it was on the hairiest alternative dirt road I've driven on, and I was grateful the hire company couldn't see what I was doing with their vehicle. We head out and west, towards the drier parts of the province, where the great leopard tortoises amble in ancient stillness across the road, and the temperatures suddenly rise to desert levels. I've talked previously of New Bethesda and the Karoo. The Eastern Cape has, relatively speaking, just a sliver of that landscape, but it's a powerful one. In the lush, preserved places in the east, the kinds and cultures of unseen beings must surely be as rife as the numbers of psychedelic, edible, poisonous and medicinal mushrooms available in damp spots, all of which are listed on a poster at our Hogsback campsite. The west of the province, by contrast, is a land where God is mostly one, like the sun. Yet even here it's clear the ancestors are doing their work. Helen Martin forged her eerie cement cosmology in the back garden of the Owl House, the owl spirit beings watching over her as she carried on, painfully, rejected by the old Kerk. Since her horrible death, art has flourished. Fugard himself has moved into the Dorpy in his old age, and craft too. Those she trained have handed their wisdom on. We buy an owl from the grandson of her assistant. In Hogsback there used to be a fairy garden, statues amidst leaves of different elemental souls, though they've apparently been packed up for now and removed to the tamer trees of Bathurst, leaving the area to the real fairies. Few trees in New Bethesda, though the cacti were blooming, a genuine blessing since that happens for just one day in a summer. Furrows, small canals, cleverly divert water around the village, including the remaining pastures which punctuate the quiet houses, like medieval common land. Except that it's all owned by the old Afrikaans families for now. Art galleries with an abundance of styles and mediums. Fine food in dining rooms full of curios. The Karoo aesthetic here is, of course, abundant. Ancient farm machinery, wagon wheels, and the skulls of beasts with wind-battered woodwork. But alongside it, there's an awareness of what the land brings. Stone people, out of town, sculpted to make us stop and reflect, and breathe into the stories of the kloofs. A bookshop to get lost in, offering more treasures gathered from generations. My partner reflects that this gathering, hoarding, is somehow a Euro-African response to the traditional tribal desire to move on and let go. Collecting is a habit that perhaps has behind it the original Sangoma's bag of bones, objects imbued with the power of talismans, of place, of spirit. Perhaps Helen Martin's yard is a dramatic version of that too, casting its spell to ensure that something new is ushered into being continually here, even below that potent sun that is so constant. There amidst the cement and under the blue sky there are flowers creeping. Some of the roads are shown on the map as tarred when they're nothing of the sort. Perhaps somebody pocketed the money and claimed that it had been done, though in the village there's a fight going on to keep the night sky open, against a provincial demand for street lights to be installed, centralising safetyism at work. They've at least so far kept the tar at bay here where it's not wanted. The road back west to Willowmore is one of the strangest I've driven on. A single-lane concrete track with dirt passages either side, and on which I've headed west between the mountain ranges on many occasions. Idiosyncrasy a virtue in provincial places. Near here is where our ancestors watched springbok in their thousands, charging annually across the Vlakte. Some of them watched with bows and arrows, others from their stoops. Some dream of recreating this enormous corridor for the herd to return. Today there are inquisitive euphorbias, but also plenty of sheep around Janssenville where the mohair industry is based. These days the main wilderness is to the south, into the Baviaanskloof, where there's a bunch of spreading flowers, dinosaur-imitating rocks, tree houses, baboons, tortoises and rebels. Not to be visited on this trip, but of course I will go back to the Eastern Cape. It's too full of story not to return. So, thank you for listening to this latest episode in the series, and you can find all of my articles and my recordings at lucidfringe.substack.com, except my music and poetry from the past, which is all available at simrickyarrow, all one word, .bandcamp.com, and the background recordings and sounds that you will have heard are all either from those recordings or they are my own. Please do give this a rating if it's on your podcast app. Please spread the word if you enjoy what you hear, and if you want to give me some feedback or commentary, of course I'm very open to that. Any suggestions for future episodes? Okay, enjoy. See you next time. Ravings from the Lucid Fringe. Ravings from the Lucid Fringe. Musings from an unpasteurized life. Improvised on the front line of love and